Intelligence senior U.S. policy analyst, somebody we've talked with, I should say, about the Genius Act, the future of market structure legislation. We just heard, Nathan, welcome back, from one of the authors of that bill, the Genius Act. Seems to think it will not be on the floor this week, but next. Is that true? Will it pass next week?
I actually think it will. And I think Senator Lummis hit it on the head when she called out the Senator Marshall bill, the Credit Card Competition Act. Because
she went right for it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the bill that would, if there's going to be roadblocks to this bill, it's going to be that amendment. Anybody who's flown through LaGuardia or Reagan has probably seen the adverts that this bill, this credit card bill, could put these airline credit card reward programs at risk.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with stablecoins, but it's a bill that puts the banks versus the retailers versus the airlines. And when you get a situation like that, most of the senators just stick their hands up and say, I can't deal with this. So I think that amendment gets withdrawn. And eventually this bill does pass, and I think it goes to the House, and it gets done probably late June, early July.
So we have to go through a protracted amendment process, right? Democrats are going to try to make this painful, but you don't see the credit card, the swipe fee bills not going to make it.
No, I think it's just too heavy of a lift right now, especially on a bill that really the crypto industry wants to see this get done. Mm-hmm. And I would also point out is that, there was this discussion about payment for yield or, the payment. Yeah. Senator Lummis essentially said, look, the House is going to take a look at that. I don't think the provision flies because that is one of the provisions that I think is a no-go with the Democrats. So I don't think stablecoins are going to be able to pay yield under this bill.
There were a lot of questions about a potential national Bitcoin reserve or crypto reserve. Senator Lummis was quick to slow Tim and Shanali down to say we need a market structure bill first. That's going to be the sequencing, right? If this passes, what does that help unlock when it comes to the Clarity Act?
So the Clarity Act potentially could get a markup next week in the House Financial Services, House Ag Committees. This bill is like manna from heaven for the crypto industry. Yeah. I mean, stablecoins is just stablecoins.
This is FIT 21 with a different name, or is there more to it than that?
It's FIT 21 plus a different name. So it clarifies what is a commodity versus what it is a security. Yep. Most of the crypto world wants to be in the commodity space because then you're under the CFTC. Right. They have principles-based regulation as opposed to prescriptive-based regulation. Essentially, it's a little bit more innovative and a little bit less enforcement risk. And that's why this bill, which would actually give the CFTC authority over spot markets, is very much sought after. The challenge with the Clarity Act is that for all the headaches the Democrats were giving in terms of trying to get the Genius Act through, those headaches are even pronounced even more on the Clarity Act because there was general bipartisan agreement that there is a regulatory gap, if you will, for stablecoins. Yeah. There are still a lot of people like Senator Elizabeth Warren out there that think that 1930s era securities law is good enough for the crypto world, and they're going to be much more difficult to get across the line. I think the Clarity Act doesn't get passed until next year.
Wow. How much of this has to do with the overhang of the Trump involvement, the Trump meme coin, the conflict of interest that we keep hearing has the potential to slow things down? But why?
Well, you don't want to give President Trump a win if you're a Democrat.
All it is?
I think that's partly it. I mean, also there is, within the stablecoin bill, there was a lot of push over illicit finance, KYC, know your customer, AML, anti-money laundering. Any of those types of issues or provisions, I think, can get resolved, especially under the Clarity Act. We're talking about KYC. I don't think KYC usually ultimately disrupts legislation. Right. But the idea for President Trump and his family being involved in meme coin, it's really difficult for policymakers to say that I'm going to support a regulatory framework that allows individuals to put in their dollars when they see meme coins or other bad words talked about meme coins. Right. That makes it a little bit harder for policymakers to actually move forward.
There's going to be no Dogecoin in the National Reserve.
Well, no, and actually I think that was one of the most interesting things Senator Lummis said is she said Bitcoin only. Only. Now, when President Trump put out his executive order from earlier this year, things like Ethereum and Solana were mentioned. But if it's Bitcoin only, and the United States has a tremendous amount of Bitcoin and Ethereum already due to, essentially just enforcement actions and so forth. But if a strategic Bitcoin reserve actually moves forward with the idea that the United States is purchasing Bitcoin, that leaves the Ethereum Solana out. Maybe some of those traders aren't going to like that.
Wow-wee. Producer James is very upset about the Dogecoin thing. We thought we were onto something. Bitcoin, by the way, up 1.5% over $1,500, holding well above $106,000 here. The idea of a national crypto reserve or exclusive Bitcoin reserve would inherently send this price higher, I assume. But what does the country get out of it? Why would we make this investment?
So when it comes to all three of these bills that we're talking about, one way to think about it is, are you looking at it through a retail trader, or are you looking at it through an institutional trader or an institution like Coinbase or Robinhood?
Okay.
If you're a retail trader, look, you want the United States to be purchasing Bitcoin. You want other people to be purchasing Bitcoin. As a result, the price goes higher. But if you're on Coinbase and Robinhood, the idea here is just institutional usage. The price is actually somewhat irrelevant for right now.
Sure.
The idea here is you want people to use more of it. So Washington tends to be looking at this through the eyes of just wanting to get more people to use this, the bipartisan folks between all these bills. It's not thinking about price. So on the retail side, if you just want something that's going to drive the price up, you may have to just keep your expectations in check, because Washington isn't exactly thinking of that method. They're thinking more about just getting the regulatory framework in place so that institutions and people can ultimately continue to start using it more and more.
I guess that would explain the price here. You running odds on reconciliation? There was a question for the senator at the end. They're going to be tinkering around with this bill in the days ahead. What kind of odds do you have on this bill right now, and how different will it look in the House?
We're sticking our neck out a little bit on this one.
Yeah?
We're saying 80% by the August recess it gets done. The reason being is that I just think that because the debt ceiling is included in this bill, and plus, I think the Senate can eventually come to an agreement. You probably won't get Senator Rand Paul. We saw President Trump tweeting him this morning. I don't think you may get Senator Ron Johnson, but you may get the moderates to come on board, because the idea that our thesis is that ultimately this is going to increase the deficit, because it's easier to borrow today for tomorrow's pain than it is to actually take a vote that's going to cut either Medicaid requirements, Inflation Reduction Act requirements, or SNAP benefits. It's much easier to just say we're going to increase the deficit. And I think that's where the Senate goes.
Fascinating. Great and deep dive with Nathan Dean. Many thanks, as always, for the insights at Bloomberg Intelligence, our senior U.S. policy analyst.